I'd say thank you very much for letting me join you this afternoon, and giving me a chance to talk about my architecture. I'm now 30 years in practice, and I've succeeded in not growing my practice at all. I still work alone, and I like to be creative. And curiously, I find that solitude has actually allowed me to develop my own architectural voice. As one gentleman put it to me recently, you have your own architectural handwriting. I thought that was quite sweet. So I'm going to talk about three things that shape my architecture. Firstly, the use of the module. Secondly, the use of a steel frame to make the open plan. And thirdly, the power of repetition in architectural form. So firstly, the use of the module. The idea of using a module came about 30 years ago when I was struggling to get planning permission for a large single-storey houses. And back then, rural houses were required to have a pitched roof with limited ridge heights. So I developed a module based on the scale of the rural cottage. And by combining modules, I could make houses with larger footprints without exceeding the ridge height limit and giving them the scale of a clachan of cottages. And as I worked through this, I discovered this was not a one-trick pony. I found that I can use this design idea of combining modules in different ways to respond creatively to different contexts. And I'll show you some plans now to illustrate how I've done this. The first one is the one you have up on the screen. Thank you, Courtney. This is a contemporary farmhouse on the Ars Peninsula. It's a house for a retiring dairy farmer. And here I've shaped the form of the new house to make a traditional farmyard with some existing stone buildings. And I've then raised the house up above the field on a white semicircular plinth that allows the cattle to come right up to, but not into the house. And the semicircular plinth allows the silage to be cut right up to the wall. And you can actually see that on the little aerial there. If you go to the next slide, please, Courtney. This house uses a 7-metre wide module of different lengths with ridges running east and west to form a symmetrical plan, but an asymmetrical form that's biased towards the sea views. The plan of the house puts the working kitchen in its traditional central location, where it can survey the farmyard, but is separated from it physically by an elegant south-facing sunken garden. If you go to the next slide, please, Courtney. This is a home for a retiring couple on their family farm outside Portlanone. It's a valley that runs down to the River Bann in Church Island. And in my opinion, it must be one of the best views in Ireland. If you go to the next slide, please. The house is made up of 4 overlapping pavilions, each 7 metres by 11 metres long. And they're anchored at the roadside as they step down the hillside. And they fan out each time by 7.5-degree increments. And they form a terrace garden with the old barns that were already on the site. The result of the stepped and fanning form in each module has a slightly different view, both in level and orientation. And additionally, the fan of the modules, together with the existing barn, form a terrace garden that also expands with each step into the view. If you go to the next slide, please, Courtney. This site outside Hillsborough was rather unprepossessing, as it lay at the bottom corner of a huge cornfield that sloped all the way down from the road. And to counterbalance this, I saw the field like an amphitheatre, and the house is its terrace and the staging, and therefore the formality of the plan. So we go to the next slide, please. So here the house module is 7.08 metres with varying lengths, but the same 4-metre offset each time. You can see from the plan, it has a strong symmetrical arrangement, and the centrepiece is classically flanked with projecting modules of garage and garden house. The terrace and semicircular lawn then thrust forward out into the field like a stage. The next slide, please, Courtney. This was the site of an old estate house in Cushendun, and the original house was destroyed by a fire in the 1930s, leaving only the old colonnaded stables on an upper level and the surrounding woodland. I left the site of the old house on the lower field undisturbed, choosing instead to build on the upper level beside the stables. I then elevated the colonnaded stables to be the central celebrated piece in the composition, supported on either side by the contrasting contemporary modules. If you go to the next slide, please. The house is formed to one side of the stables overlooking the estate land, and the size of the module is scaled to be roughly the same ridge height as the monopitch of the old stables. So all 4 modules forming the house and the single module forming the garage are just 6.7 metres in width and 7.6 metres in length, and they use the same offset for a rhythmic effect. The stables were then converted into guest accommodation, and the composition is completed with the garage on the other side of the stables, forming the third side of a raised garden and terrace. Next slide, please. This is my own house, the Origami House in County Antrim. The house is an example of an elongated composition extending from the roadside across the dam and into the woodland corner that overlooks the old dam to the east and an expansive rural aspect to the west. The composition is made up of 8 modules. 7 form the house and 1 the garage, linked together with a linear arrangement of walls, steps and broad pedestrian bridge across the dam. If you go to the next slide, please. The house is arranged on the 45-degree angle, which allows the 3 central modules forming the open plan, living, kitchen, dining and sculpture space to open up into an expansive terrace, and 2 further modules act as bookends. My studio and the main bedroom and these all then together share the open aspect out onto the terrace. The composition returns then on the 45-degree angle, forming the guest bedroom modules that are set within the woodland. So the next slide, please. Continuing on the 45-degree theme, this is a tight 2-storey suburban site in Portstewart, where the sea view is unfortunately 45 degrees to the plot. The neighbouring house was set back from the building line of the street, so I could simply have stepped back a series of orthogonal modules to address the view. However, the sea views would be compromised in future if the neighbour were ever to rebuild and move his house forward onto the building line of the street, which the planners would have given him permission to do. So instead, I held the building line and turned the modules through 45 degrees so that the gables then faced towards the sea view. And the 45-degree turn resulted in a series of 3 2-storey bays that echo the Victorian bay windows of the whole area. Each module this time is just 6 metres in width, and they vary then in length. The first floor plan has 3 overlapping open plan glazed modules under a single undulating roof form. And you'll be pleased to know that it only took 2 years to get this through Coleraine planning. So it's just started on site. The second influence on my architecture was the use of a steel frame to make the open plan. When I worked in America for Michael Graves, I learned that the key to open plan design was to give each space an identity. Whilst Graves did that using a change in material, colour or level, I realised later in my own work that it could also be done using roofscape. So with my modular designs becoming more complex, I developed with my structural engineer a slimline steel frame that would slot inside cavities and roof structure, allowing me to overlap the modules whilst carving away their supporting walls, leaving a seemingly unsupported undulating roofscape. You go to the next slide, please. This is the house in Hillsborough, and it is one of the larger roofscapes I've completed, involving 5 modules with an open plan kitchen, dining, living and play space. And it extends in length to around 19 metres, which as the client's youngest child discovered, was big enough for him to cycle around. The art of making buildings is very important to me, and I was fortunate to have as teachers two great Peters, Peter Aldington and Peter Smithson, who taught me that integrity of structure and detail was fundamental. You'll see that my buildings are generally constructed in insulated cavity blockwork with a ventilated, insulated cut timber roof. My houses are achieving an air tightness of around 2, and that value doesn't change as the building dries out. I use a lot of glass in my houses, and I find that this heavyweight construction acts like a heat sink, balancing out the peaks of solar gain and leaving a very comfortable house to live in. I'm also a very keen supporter of local traditional construction skills, such as slating, plastering, joinery, stone and building and masonry building. And those skills can all be supported by how we as architects design. The next slide, please. These complex roof forms are only achievable with a steel frame, which is worked out at the planning stage and arrives on site like a big Meccano set. The Hillsborough House steel frame had 140 pieces of steel in it, so the contractor told me proudly. The frame is exceptionally fine and, to be honest, a bit wobbly when it first goes up and only stiffens up when the weight of the roof goes onto it. Next slide, please. And here's the kind of space that results from these overlapping modules. This is just 2 overlapping modules in a living, kitchen, dining space. The living space has its own complete roof, whilst the roof light defines the kitchen and dining space. Next slide, please. And this is the same house, and here you can see the dining space is further defined within the open plan by the glazed corner, making a very special place to dine in out of what is essentially an eating area in a kitchen. And the next slide, please. And this is the upper floor of another house, and it shows the effect of 3 overlapping modules. The living space has the roof of the first module, and the dining space has the roof of the second module, and the kitchen has the roof of the third module, which extends then back to accommodate the bedroom beyond. My third influence is the power of repetition in architectural form. As a young architect, I spent a year in Italy at the British School at Rome as the first person in Northern Ireland to be awarded the British Rome Scholarship, a British and Commonwealth prize for research artists, historians, archaeologists and architects. It was a tremendous privilege to live and do research at the British School at Rome for a whole year, completely left to my own devices. I chose to study fascist architecture, and in particular the work of a young architect, Giuseppe Torragni. It was not a trendy subject at that time, and usually a complete conversation killer, as even 30 years ago, it was still a pretty unmentionable period. And what I learned from my research and what I carried forward into my own architecture was how Torragni used repetition in his architecture, the same way the military use it, the same way propagandists use it, and the same way speechwriters use it as a powerful tool. So by taking the form of the humble rural cottage, making an abstract modular form of it, and then repeating it across the landscape, I could create a resonance that is extremely powerful. And I'll show you now some houses where I think it works particularly well. So next slide, please, Courtney. If you recall, this was the prepossessing site at the bottom corner of a field outside Hillsborough, and it needed a powerful form. And this is a very classical arrangement. The principal house is flanked by 2 pavilions. The difference here is that the whole arrangement is composed with the same repeated module. And whilst the plan is symmetrical, the elevation is asymmetrical and abstract. The classical symmetrical layout combined with the repeated module to command the view of the encroaching hillside. Next slide, please. And this is the wee house in Portlanone, 4 repeated modules spanning out from the roadside to embrace the view. A memorable image simply using repetition of a humble rural form. An abstract interpretation of the Clachan. And next slide, please. I don't always overlap modules. Here I've used just 3 modules that simply abut. Instead, stone chimneys forming the gable ends march in unison across the terrace.
Jane, you're out of sequence for the slides.
Oh, am I? Well, I've only got one more slide to
Okay.
go. Hopefully you'll get the next one. The last one is my origami house, is that right?
It's on now, yeah.
Okay. Here is the origami house where the composition is 8 modules, 7 in the house and 1 across the dam, forming the garage. The composition, while symmetrical on plan along 45-degree angle, is asymmetrical from this elevation. And the repetition of the glazed corners across the terrace makes a very powerful image. And I've terminated the run of repeating gables by reversing the last one and stepping it forward. So what I've learned is that by breaking down the form, I can create more spaces around the house, and I can better embrace the landscape from many different aspects. And I remember Peter Oldington advising to always leave the site bigger with the house on it than it was without it. I've also learned how Hugh Newell Jacobson, who broke down the scale of his houses using multiple forms, brought the composition together with one material, sometimes traditional clapboarding and sometimes hand-cut stone. And Geoffrey Bawa eroded the walls of his houses in Sri Lanka so that the house and garden became seamless. And I do the same, but use sliding glass rather than insect screens. And I go so far as to carry the same floor material, including the tiling pattern, from inside to outside to further engage the house and the garden. There are 2 strands of modernism, the formal strand of Touranier, Le Corbusier and Mies van der Rohe, and the more organic departure by Alvar Aalto. And I think the 3 architects I previously mentioned extended Aalto's lessons to their particular place, south of England, the east coast of America, and Sri Lanka. And I'd like to think that on the shoulders of these architects, I've done my little bit of architectural handwriting for Northern Ireland. So anyway, thank you. It's been a pleasure to take you through what shapes my architecture. I'm happy to answer any questions, even though I can't see any of you now.
Okay, so are there any questions?
Jane, thank you so much for the presentation. Have you changed your approach over the years, or have you found a sort of a comfort zone where you're like, I know this works, I'm going to stick with it?
You become more sophisticated. So you don't start by having some kind of mind-blowing epiphany. You start by making small moves and realization. And I remember the very first time that I thought I wanted to tackle a Northern Ireland bungalow. And that was like, I was in a call with a client who had the opportunity to build and I said to him, well, if you're going to build on top of the hill, you're going to have to go single story. And he turned around to his wife with such a sense of disappointment in his voice, and he says, we're getting a bungalow. And I thought, oh my goodness, to start your life dream with that negative, we're getting a bungalow. And I decided then that I was going to tackle the Northern Ireland bungalow. And so my pavilion and modular houses developed from there, from something that kind of worked but wasn't terribly sophisticated to now the ones that are highly sophisticated and responding to lots and lots of different contexts.
Very good. Any other questions or comments out there?
I think it's fair. I think it's fair to say, Jane, you have your own particular style. And when you drive around the countryside in Northern Ireland, you can see these houses, and you just immediately say, "That's a Jane Burnside. That's a Jane Burnside house." It's very distinct. And yeah, as I say, and they're very sophisticated. People don't realize how sophisticated it is to interlock the forms like that, and also to get the spaces within. So, and as far as I can see, there's no other houses like those. So I think it's very unique to you. So anyway, Ian, over to you.
Thanks very much. No, I always like taking the opportunity whenever nobody else jumps in for questions. Then you get to oh, there we go. As I was just about to ask another one whenever I see that Aoife has a question, but her audio isn't working. So I am going to ask the question on Aoife's behalf if she wants to write it. Okay, so I imagine that background Aoife can hear me, and yes. Oh, very good. What would Jane's advice be to young women in architecture?
Good one.
What would my advice be? I think the world has changed so rapidly for women in architecture. When I started out in architecture, there were very few women in practice. I was the first lecturer, female lecturer in Queen's Architecture. I mean, that's hard to believe. I'm not that old. But I was the first. I mean, it's extraordinary.
Yeah.
And but things have changed a lot for women, which is all to the good. And we now face the same challenges that men do. So I noticed there was a little chat from somebody that came in and said, it's my turn to go and do the school run. And that was from a gentleman. And that wouldn't have happened 30 years ago when I started out. So women have come a long way, families have come a long way. And we need to design houses that reflect that change. And I thoroughly applaud women and men who continue in architecture and have a family, because it's not an easy one.
Gina, I have a question, another question in on the chat. Maybe the chat's the easier way for people to raise their questions. And this is a technical one from Colm Donaghy. What software do you use?
Zoom mostly, not Teams. I'm at the point where I kind of go, the best software is the one that I'm most used to. Hence, I could do Zoom, but I really struggle with Teams. So yeah, I'm really behind the post. I decided that I just couldn't manage Revit, and although it would have suited my architecture in that everything is precise from word go, I just find it too much to do that. So I'm sorry if I've disappointed you that I haven't engaged with Revit.
Not at all, not at all. It's you know, each to their own on what works best. Any other questions there for anybody? I have one final one if anybody else doesn't, but I don't see any others coming through.
Yes,
Jane,
I have a question.
oh, sorry, Greg, go on ahead there.
Jane, how are you doing?
Hello, Greg. I saw you on the wee video. I don't think we've seen each other for about 30 years.
No, well, I'm in Saudi Arabia, so it's quite a distance.
Well, lovely to see you.
I'm just wondering, with the use of steel, how does the cost compare, say, with a traditional built single-story house?
Well, I would say, well, at the moment, all construction costs are insane. And I'm sure you would all concur with that. We had been building my houses at around less than £200 a square foot. And you know, now it's 350. It's really crazy. But it's always a case of what you know, what you're really looking for in terms of the experience of living in a house. If you want to create these Jane houses, then you're going to need a steel frame. And I've gone through the roller coaster of steelwork being incredibly cheap to being incredibly expensive. It seems to be one of the materials that fluctuates so much.
You must have found it incredibly difficult, Jane, in that period where steel prices didn't just go up, but went up so enormously quickly.
Yeah, but it doesn't, in the overall build, it doesn't occupy that much of the budget.
Yeah.
So, you know, you'll maybe pay 15 grand for steel. So if it doubles, you're looking at another 15 grand. You're not looking at another 100 grand.
Jane, my final question for you was, you've spoken today about housing, and have you any burning desire to undertake any projects in different typologies?
Well, I think that's very interesting. Greg and I worked together on the concert hall in Belfast. And what I learned from that was how long it took to go from design through to it actually being built. And this quick turnaround of houses really, I find suits me, because I can develop an idea and develop it relatively quickly. You know, so you said that, well, you can drive around the countryside and you can spot Jane houses. I probably wouldn't have been able to do that if I had either been working in a large practice or even a medium-sized practice. And it's really only been because I've been working on my own and with projects that have a short turnaround that I've been able to achieve that.
Mm-hmm.
So it kind of goes back to the question from Aoife, where she said, what would your advice be to young architects? I think you have to set out what you're really interested in doing. I think you have to nowadays be exceptionally good. Well, you all know it's a very, very tough, very competitive world. And so for any young architect, male or female, working on your own in a small practice or by yourself, it's a lonely furrow, and it may not suit you, but you may love the invigorating experience of working in a big team. And so those are the sort of things that you have to figure out when you're young.
Oh, thanks very much.